welcome. This is Ethiopian Insight. Today we have invited Ambassador Shinn to Ethiopian Satellite Television Network to share his opinion on the current Ethiopian political situation. Ambassador Shinn was an ambassador, the US ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1999. He has been actively engaged in Ethiopian politics, and today he will share his perspective on the conflict in Tigray, on the GERD, and also on the potential conflict in the Sudan. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to join you.
Maybe let's start with your evaluation of the current political situation in Ethiopia.
I find the current situation very troubling, quite frankly. I've been following Ethiopian affairs going all the way back to the 1960s when I served as the assistant desk officer in the State Department for Ethiopia. And I have sort of continued to follow Ethiopia ever since, albeit sporadically. I've obviously been assigned to other countries and was not focused on Ethiopia on those occasions. But I find that the situation today, I think, puts Ethiopia something of a watershed. It's trying to decide what its future ought to be in terms of its governing system. And I don't think it's found an answer to that yet. I think the situation in Tigray simply underscores that point. But it's only one of many concerns that I have about what is happening in Ethiopia today. I'm very concerned about the focus on ethnicity, on ethnic violence that has occurred in recent years, preceding the events in Tigray, and which continues to be a problem. Not to mention all of the international dimensions that Ethiopia has to face that I gather we'll get into later, like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and relations with neighboring countries. But the internal political situation is very troubling, and primarily because of the very heavy focus on ethnicity.
As you know, Ethiopia was divided into ethnic enclaves called Kilil after the 1991 TPLF victory. Do you think that is the primary reason for the current conflict?
I don't think it's the primary reason. I think it probably contributed to the concerns that I just expressed, but I think the problem predates that. And the fact that you didn't have ethnic federalism prior to 1991 does not mean there were not ethnic issues in the country. I think they were very much there. And the focus on ethnic federalism simply underscored the differences. I think that the effort to create ethnic federalism was done initially with good intention. I think it was seen as a way to deal with some of the past governing problems in Ethiopia, but I don't think it had the desired effect. And we're now seeing the outcome of that, particularly with what is happening in Tigray region.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, as you know, Ethiopia is not the only multi-ethnic country. Many African countries, and I know you were the ambassador in Burkina Faso, and I suspect at least the bordering countries of Nigeria, Ghana are multi-ethnic. They do have ethnic or equality problems, but they try to solve it under constitutional means, which centered on citizenship or on individuals, whereas in Ethiopia, the attempt was the central theme of ethnicity. When we look at these countries today, Ethiopia, there is civil strife, inter-ethnic violence, whereas in Ghana or Chad or Nigeria, and even our neighbors, Kenya or Uganda, there are no ethnic strife. So wouldn't that suggest that while ethnic questions did predate TPLF, the problem is ethnicity or ethnic politics, I should say?
Well, first off, I'm not sure I would agree with your premise. If you look at Chad, where I briefly served as chargé d'affaires, if you look at Kenya, where I served as a political officer, if you look at any number of countries that I have served in, they have had some fairly serious ethnic problems, including those two in particular. The one country that I've served in that has managed to avoid a lot of the ethnic problems was Tanzania. It has done, I think, fairly well in avoiding that particular problem. You mentioned Ghana. I would agree. Ghana has done a pretty good job at avoiding it. Nigeria has not. Nigeria had Biafra, after all, a horrific ethnic problem going back in history. So you have a real mixed situation in Africa, where some countries have done well with handling ethnicity and others have not done well.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to dwell on this, but if we look at Nigeria, after the Biafra war, Nigeria restructured its federal system. It also amended its constitution, and it outlawed ethnic politics, ethnic-based parties. So, I mean, many Ethiopians agree that ethnic inequality should be addressed, but there has never been a nation-state built on identity politics. How would you answer that?
Well, as I say, I'm not convinced that that an ethnic-based governance is the best way to go. I think that there are real questions being raised about it today, and appropriate questions are being raised. Unfortunately, you have in Ethiopia today a lot of strong support still for what I would call either Tigrayan nationalism, Amhara nationalism, or Oromo nationalism. You have elements of all of these societies that I think would rather see more of an Ethiopian based structure that tries to move away from nationalism. And I think over the long term, that probably is the best answer for the country. The problem is making this transition from the still strong support for ethnic nationalism to something that is nationwide, that involves all ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And I would tend to agree that is ultimately the way the country has got to go in order to avoid these issues. But trying to do that overnight is I think, going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm. So let's focus on the current condition. What do you think is the primary reason for the conflict between Tigray and the federal government?
Well, I think you have two different sort of sets of reasons. You have the proximate causes, which I think most people would probably agree with. And then you have the historical reasons, some of which we just talked about, the ethnic background questions, that there might be a lot of disagreement. But if you take the proximate causes, the fact that Tigray was starting to move away from the central government, expressing more desire for autonomy in the region, went forward with elections in September of 2020 that the central government opposed. That was followed by the withholding of funding by the central government from Tigray region. That led eventually to the TPLF attack on the Northern Command in Mekelle, which may have been preceded by perceived military moves coming from the central government side. I think that's very unclear at this point. So the proximate causes, I think, are fairly clear. But what is much less clear are these historical concerns, the ethnic issues that we've already talked about, and also, quite frankly, a very long history that go back several millennia of autocratic tendencies in Ethiopia. And one doesn't talk about that very much, but I think they have been there for a long time, and I think they remain there to some extent to the present day.
Mm-hmm. Talking of autocratic history, most of the rulers for Ethiopia come from the north. When we talk about autocratic rulers, Dr. Abiy is from the south, and generally it is understood there is a more, what should I say, non-autocratic culture in the South. And I think Dr. Abiy's personality seems to follow that. And many people think Dr. Abiy is trying to transition the country from ethnicity to sort of citizenship-based politics, and the conflict is between those who had vested interest in the old regime and the new transition forces. How do you look at that?
Well, obviously, I'm not in a position to read the mind of Prime Minister Abiy. That may very well be his concern or his interest. I've read his translations of his documents on Medimur, and I sort of have some understanding of what he seems to be trying to do. What he was doing initially seemed to be a little more along those lines than perhaps what I'm seeing today. I wonder maybe there's been something of a transition in his own thinking as to how to make all of this work. But I'm not in the best position to judge what his thinking is at this point.
Mm-hmm. I understand that, Ambassador, but I, as a policy maker in the past, what I'm trying to get insight to is when foreign diplomats in Ethiopia or in any other African countries, when they look at a country, a political system in transition, I'm assuming they evaluate the difficulty of transforming a country, transforming society. And with that perspective, and it looks like the American government seems to have given the benefit of the doubt to Dr. Abiy. And what do you think should the U.S. Government do to help Ethiopia resolve this problem?
I would agree with you. I think initially the position of the American government, which I do not speak for, I should emphasize, was to favor what Prime Minister Abiy was doing. And I think that continued well into the events, the recent events in Tigray. Then I think there started to be a bit of a shift where the U.S. government, to the extent it was still following events in Ethiopia as we were moving into our own rather troubled presidential transition, I think there was something of a shift and more concern being expressed as to where all of this was leading. Perhaps a concern that the democratic tendencies that had been clearly demonstrated by Dr. Abiy initially were being challenged to some extent. And today I look at the U.S. government position, and I'm not sure I see much of a position, but that's not too surprising in that the whole focus is on our own transition in the United States at the moment. You're right. I think diplomats generally from whatever country do look at structural change in the countries where they are assigned. I certainly tried to do that when I served in Ethiopia and in other countries. Different diplomats are going to see it differently. Those from China or Russia perhaps are going to see the developments in Ethiopia differently than those from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, for example. But that certainly is a goal of what the diplomatic corps tries to do.
Mm-hmm. As you have indicated in some of your writings, Ethiopia is sort of an anchor state to that region. So the failure of Ethiopia would be quite dangerous for the Horn of Africa and probably will precipitate heavy migration into Europe. So what do you think Europeans and the United States, the West, should do? On the one hand, I would like to think the West political system originates in individual liberty, not identity rights. And Ethiopia is trying to make this transition. In spite of all the problems we are looking at it, do you think the West should support the current government?
I think the West should support whomever is truly trying to install democratic principles. Now we can argue a little bit as to what those principles are, how they're interpreted in different societies in different countries. But I think Western values, and obviously I speak from a very biased point of view, are still essentially the best ones to follow. To the extent that the government is pursuing those, then the government should be supported, yes. To the extent the government is straying from those principles, it should be called out. One of the areas that is of concern to me at the moment is the degree to which humanitarian assistance is being allowed in Tigray, for example. I think there are some lapses there. I think that it's not, the region is not being totally open to humanitarian organizations, and I think more progress needs to be made in that regard. If it is, I think there will be more support for the government in Addis Ababa.
I agree. Humanitarian assistance should be accessible to the people of Tigray. But part of the problem I observe is most of the information we get is rather biased, either on the government side or on the other side. So many people say there are very respectable Tigrayans in Mekelle, in the capital city of Tigray, and we don't hear as a dire situation from them. We hear the dire situation from the diaspora, Tigrayan community from the diaspora, and also the international humanitarian organization. And as you know, given the 1977 history of TPLF, using humanitarian assistance for political purposes, the government is very hesitant. Is there a way to address the concern of the government, but also to address humanitarian assistance you think that the West can support?
Well, I think that the government of Ethiopia has issued some pretty dire facts on the situation in Tigray today. The report that was issued on January 1 of this year by the Tigray Emergency Coordination Center, which is a government center based in Tigray region, reported that some 4.5 million people in Tigray region are in need of emergency food, and that there are some 2.2 million internally displaced persons in Tigray. That's a huge percentage of the population there. Now, those are government figures. They're not Ethiopian diaspora figures. And I think part of the problem is that Tigray region has not been opened to the public. It has not been open for reporters to indicate exactly what is going on in the region. I think that's one of the issues that needs to be resolved. It needs to be opened up so that there is more transparency. I agree with you that there is far too much misinformation coming from all elements of social media, and that is not helpful at all. But I think by opening up Tigray to the humanitarian groups, letting them do their job openly and freely, making the region available to the independent media, I think we'll be in a much better situation.
Mm-hmm. So, as you know, in the last couple of days, maybe the last week, a number of former high-ranking TPLF officials have been apprehended and brought to Addis. Do you think the capture of these people will make things better and hence allow the government to open up to international organizations? It's also my understanding that some of the international help has been reaching different parts of Tigray. Is that what you understand?
Some of it has been reaching Tigray, but I still hear very significant complaints from the humanitarian organizations indicating that they are not able to go wherever they think they need to be going in order to deal with the problem. As for the recent arrests that you cited, it's impossible for me to judge what impact that might have. I think you literally have to be on the ground in Tigray talking with Tigrayans to get any understanding of that. I have said from the beginning of this war on November 3 that the ultimate outcome of the situation in Tigray will be determined by the Tigrayan people, not by the TPLF, and whether the people of Tigray generally support or do not support the TPLF. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not there. And I don't know how you answer it without being there.
Mm-hmm. So, what is your perspective? As you know, there is an election coming in 5-6 months, and it looks like it's going to take place in most of the country. And how election is one option, and of course the other option is national reconciliation. How do you think Ethiopia will overcome these divisions, whether it is in Tigray or in Benishangul Gumuz, or also in other parts of the country?
Well, the election on June 5 that you're referring to it's going to depend in large part how that election is conducted, how free and fair it is. We all know the past history of elections in Ethiopia since 1991. The only one that really was, in my view, relatively free and fair was in 2005. The others were frankly lacking in many respects. I have no idea how this one in June is going to take place. It's going to be, I think, somewhat difficult to do it without a recent census. It would be good if a census had been done in advance. That certainly is not possible between now and June 5. But even more important than the census is the degree to which groups are able to contest the election, have more or less equal access to all media, including government media. And there are just a lot of questions in my mind as to how this can transpire between now and June 5. We're talking about 5 months away. That is not a long time.
Mm-hmm. Given the situation, as you said, as you know, the election was postponed. It was supposed to happen last year, and it was postponed. Now, the argument is it's better to have the election rather than extending it again. So, given these situations, and as you said, the historical record of elections not being very democratic, free or fair, do you think the election should be held, or it should be maybe rescheduled so that national reconciliation should happen, and also more robust election monitoring can be done?
Well, that's an excellent question, and frankly I'm very torn on that issue. I could make an argument going either way, whether that is either to have the election on June 5 or not to have it on June 5. I think to some extent, putting a date out there may take a little bit of pressure off of the government in Addis Ababa that it's trying to do something to move the issue forward. But I really do worry about the degree of preparation that can go into a campaign between now and June 5. It just means that an enormous amount has to be done, and I worry that whether or not that's possible. But I'm real torn on that question. I can literally go either way with it.
Mm-hmm. One more question on this. As you know, the election board has been reconstituted, and a former prisoner, opposition leader, Mr. is the head of it, and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, who was in the United States and who worked, I believe, for Amnesty International, is the head of the human rights organization, and they have shown some independence from the government. And as you know, institutional building takes generations. Does that give you hope that there will be improvement, even incremental improvement in the elections?
It does some hope. clearly the Electoral Commission needs to be as independent as it can possibly be. And that's a step in the right direction. But there are so many other issues that have to be resolved between now and June 5, which means that there has to be a commitment by the government in Addis Ababa to allow free and fair elections to take place. And if the government is truly committed to that, then that will be a huge step forward. If the government is not committed to it, then we may see something along the lines that we've seen in Ethiopia in so many past elections, elections that simply don't reflect a true willingness to allow opposition to challenge the ruling government or the perceived ruling government at the time.
Mm-hmm. So I think, as you say, we all want free and fair elections. So given the history and given the limitations of the government and the different institutions that support elections, what should the West, in particular, and in general the West, do in order to make the election viable or get accepted by the majority of the people?
Well, I think Western governments generally can offer a whole range of assistance to help ensure that the mechanics of the election take place effectively, freely, fairly, and efficiently. This can be everything from providing monetary resources to ensuring that it's just possible to vote throughout the country in a safe and an effective manner. I think that it means providing election observers around the country. That means the government has to approve that and be willing to have election observers. There might be some training that could go into it. And I think for the most part, Western governments would be willing to do that. They certainly have in the past, and I see no reason why they wouldn't be willing to do so this time.
How about the role of NDI, NED, all the sort of democratic advocating organization in the United States? I know last year at this time I was in Addis, and they were in Addis and they were assisting in the in preparation for the election. Do you think they should take a more active role and help the government?
Well, they can only be as active as the government will allow them to be. But my answer, I would answer the question by saying yes, they should be more active if the government is willing to allow them to be active. But they are very much restrained by what the government will allow them to do.
From your answer, I sense a suspicion of the government. Is it based on something the government has done vis-a-vis the elections, or is it from the historical challenges of Ethiopian elections?
No, it's just the historical challenges of elections in Ethiopia. It's just that I've spent too many years observing elections in Ethiopia that were very lacking.
Okay. So to finish the issue of with Tigray, do you see any way back for TPLF into the Ethiopian political environment?
Again, it depends 100% upon the will of the Tigrayan people. And if they are still firmly in support of the TPLF, then I would see a way back. If they are not, then the TPLF is finished.
So that will be settled by an election. I guess that's what you're saying, right?
Well, an election is the easiest way to do it. My understanding is that in this election on June 5, there will not be an election in Tigray. Maybe I'm misinformed on that point. But if there's no election in Tigray, then there's no way to judge that. But I would think that, yes, I would think an election would be the best way to do that. A free and fair election, I might add.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you have followed. There are new I don't want to say new Tigrayans that have taken the helm of power in Tigray. do you give them the benefit of the doubt? Do you think they will bring the Tigrayan community back into the Ethiopian politics?
It's impossible for me to say whether they are basically puppets that have been installed or whether they have widespread support, and I have no way of judging that. I would literally have to be on the ground in Tigray talking to large numbers of Tigrayans to judge that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I should ask one. I was going to go to the GERD, but let me just ask one question. When you were ambassador in Ethiopia in 1996 to 1999, I mean, some Ethiopian communities, I will say the Amaras and to some extent the Oromos, were hesitant about the TPLF rule in Ethiopia. How did you guys gauge the embassy? How did the embassy gauge the acceptance of TPLF by the Amharas or the Oromos or some other communities? You have repeatedly said the Tigrayan people have to show they will determine whether TPLF is back or not. Did you guys also feel that way, that some of the ethnic groups were aggrieved?
No, I'm sorry, that some of the ethnic groups were which?
Were not accepting the political order?
Oh, I think clearly some of the ethnic groups were not accepting the political order at the time. I don't think there is any doubt about that. It was very obvious that the TPLF during the years of the EPRDF had most of the control of the EPRDF. I don't think anyone disputed that. That is, I think, one of the reasons why you have the animosity that you have today in Ethiopia vis-a-vis the TPLF. So, no, we saw that. The fact is we had a government that we had to deal with, and we dealt with it. We also reached out to the extent that we could to all of the other governing communities in Ethiopia from whatever ethnic group they were from. That's why I personally traveled constantly throughout Ethiopia on multiple occasions, was to reach out to all groups. It was a lot easier to do it as I was traveling through Somali region or Benishangul region or Amhara or Oromia than it was in Addis Ababa, although we tried to do it there too. So no, we saw that, and I think it was well understood at the time that the TPLF had pretty much of a stranglehold on the security apparatus. I think there was more division of power in the other parts of the government, but on the security side, it was very heavily TPLF.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go to the regional issues. As you might have heard, Sudan seems to be moving its military to the border of Ethiopia. Actually, it has taken some territory in Ethiopia. And it looks like the territorial gains of Sudan, along with the GERD issue, instability in the Horn of Africa. What do you think is driving Sudan's belligerence, if you will? I use that word. Maybe I should say Sudan's behavior in the last couple of months. What do you think is driving this?
Yeah, I'm a little perplexed, quite frankly, as to what is driving this. If you back up to the beginning of last year, I saw almost an alliance between Sudan and Ethiopia on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam issue. At least I saw the Sudanese taking a far more welcoming or accepting position on it than certainly Egypt was. And it looked like, to some extent, Sudan was even being somewhat supportive of the Ethiopian point of view. The situation obviously became more complex with the outbreak of fighting in Tigray, particularly with the movement of some 55,000 refugees into Sudan from Tigray region. That in and of itself caused something of an issue for the Sudanese. They had to figure out a way to deal with the refugees together with UNHCR and humanitarian organizations. but it also caused an old boundary issue to flare up. This is not a new issue between Sudan and Ethiopia, but I am a little surprised that Sudan has chosen to emphasize the issue now. It does almost look like it's trying to take advantage of a situation vis-a-vis Ethiopia. And if that's correct, then that I think is unfortunate. And I'm not sure that I fully understand the reasons behind it. As you know, the government in Sudan is very much a mixture of a military government and a civilian government. And to the extent that you have a desire in Sudan to create problems for Ethiopia over this border question, my guess is it's coming more from the military side than it is the Sudanese side. I can't imagine that Prime Minister Hamdok in Sudan is that interested in exacerbating relations with Ethiopia. I would think that he would want to maintain as close a relationship and as cordial a relationship as possible. But it's much more difficult to speak for what the military intentions are, particularly when the military in Sudan is also divided. So as I say, I'm a little perplexed by Sudan's position on this.
Do you think Sudan is acting alone, or do you think there are forces behind it, particularly that are concerned about the Grand Renaissance Dam?
Well, again, without really knowing the military connections of Sudan with, for example, Egypt, it's very hard for me to judge that. I guess I would not rule out that there might be some pressure behind the scene. I doubt very much that Prime Minister Hamdok would be involved in that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't think that's the way he operates. But he does not have total control of Sudan. So you have a very complex situation going on in Sudan at the moment, and a lot happening that those of us on the outside are just simply not privy to.
I know you have you were the chief of mission in Khartoum, and of course the ambassador in Addis Ababa. And you know that Ethiopia is a much bigger country, population-wise, and all that. And like Ethiopia, Sudan has also its own internal problems, you know, Darfur and all that type of thing. If war was to break out, do you think it is a war one side can easily win, or it will be a stalemate and the instability in the Horn of Africa will get exacerbated?
Well, 2 points I would make on that. One minor correction: I was the deputy chief of mission at the embassy in Khartoum, not the chief of mission. And that was back in the mid 1980s, so that was a long time ago. But I do follow Sudan. I continue to follow Sudan. First off, I don't think war will break out between Sudan and Ethiopia. I don't think that even Sudan would see it in its interests to have a war with Ethiopia. The situation is too fragile in Sudan for it to be tempted to do that. And if I'm wrong, and if a war does break out, it would, I can assure you, be a stalemate. Nobody would win that war. There would be two big losers, Sudan and Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm. So I want to proceed to the GERD. What do you think is? Do you think there will be an agreement between the three countries, Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, on the GERD?
I do think there will be an agreement, but I've been saying that for several years, and I've been wrong for several years. So I suppose it's quite possible I could be wrong again on it. It is certainly in the interest of all three countries to reach an agreement. I think I understand the reasons why there continues to be disagreement, and it has, in my view, less to do with the filling rate of the reservoir behind the GERD than it has to do with a a hypothetical situation whereby you might have in the years to come 5 or 6 years of serious drought in the Nile Basin region, significantly lowering the water level in both the White Nile and the Blue Nile and the other tributaries that feed into the Nile, obviously creating a problem for Egypt because of a long drought, as Egypt experienced in the 1980s. And Ethiopia is obviously reluctant, and I can understand why, to guarantee a certain flow of water to Egypt should there be a prolonged drought. It would mean they would have to shut down their electrical generation at the GERD if they agreed to some sort of formal arrangement for assuring water flowing to Egypt during 5-6 years of major drought. If I were in Ethiopia, I would be very reluctant to go along with that either. If the GERD dam were not there, if it did not exist, Egypt would have this problem.
Yes.
I mean, it would be exactly the same problem. So in effect, Egypt seems to be asking for something that that it wants Ethiopia to solve, but it's a problem created by Mother Nature. And that doesn't strike me as being a very fair proposition for Ethiopia. On the other hand, there can be things that can be done where even in years of long drought, Ethiopia could be helpful in ensuring perhaps somewhat more water reaching Egypt than would otherwise be the case if there were no dam there. So I think those are the kinds of things that can be worked out. But I do see that as the major sticking point at the moment.
Yeah, it looks like Ethiopia has no option but to finish the dam. And I guess maybe I should come to the United States. As you remember, about a year ago, maybe 6-7 months ago, the US had an attempted facilitatory role, and it failed. And it looks like the State Department was against what the Department of Treasury and National Security, the White House National Security Advisor, were trying to do. What do you make of that?
Well, in my view, that was a debacle from the standpoint of the United States. It never should have gotten involved in that. It was being run by the Treasury at the specific request of President Trump, who had recently been in contact with President El-Sisi in Egypt, who asked him to get involved. He agreed. Apparently, Secretary Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, was with him at the time of the communication. He turned to him and said, Mnuchin, you take care of this. So the Treasury Department ended up dealing with it. It has absolutely zero expertise on Nile water issues. It's an issue that should never be in the Treasury Department portfolio. The State Department was left totally out of it. I don't think it was so much that the State Department was opposed as that it was totally ignored. It was not part of the discussion. And the whole thing was a debacle. Eventually, Ethiopia made clear to the United States that it no longer welcomed its intervention in the issue. We were then getting closer to the election in the United States, and the Trump administration was focused on the election, not on the Horn of Africa. And as far as I can tell, it has pretty much abandoned any desire to be involved in this issue in the last couple of months. I have no idea what the Biden administration will do on this issue. I think if it's wise, it will stay out of it. But it's not clear to me whether the Biden administration has a position on it or not.
Okay, I want to go to the AU. As you know, the AU was called into action both for the dam and also for when it came to the conflict in Tigray. We all know AU has not been an effective organization. How do you assess their current abilities or capabilities and activities in Ethiopia and also vis-a-vis the dam?
Well, I think you say the AU has not been an effective organization. I think on some issues it has been relatively effective. On others, it has not. So I would be a little more careful in how I would characterize the role of the AU. I think in the case of what is happening in Tigray, I think it's very hard for the AU to play a role there. In fact, I have seen very little that it has done in that regard. I'm not even aware that it's made that much of an attempt to deal with an internal issue like Tigray. And I think the AU normally has minimal success, if any, when it's dealing with a very emotional internal African issue. On the other hand, when you look at something like the GERD, I think the AU is in a stronger position to be helpful. That's an issue that involves at least 3 countries. Actually, it involves more countries than that, but principally 3 countries. And I think it is in a position to play a useful role there. I think it has done that to some extent already. I think it ought to stay engaged with the issue. I think it's the most appropriate organization for dealing with the disagreements between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and I hope it stays engaged on it. The fact that it has not succeeded yet does not mean that it will not succeed at some point in the future. So I see a continuing role for the African Union on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Finally, I want to ask you about the diaspora, Ethiopians in the United States, from all the political divide, from all sides of the political divide. What's your advice? I know you have misgivings. What is your advice as to how we can help democratize and unify Ethiopia? What's your advice?
You know, my first piece of advice to the entire diaspora, and I have never been as disappointed with the diaspora as I have been in the last several months, and that is stop the hate speech on social media. I am very troubled by what I see on social media coming from all sides. It is completely unhelpful. It will advance nothing. If that could end tomorrow, I think the diaspora could go a long way to playing a more useful role in the future of Ethiopia. Beyond that, I think it's important that the diaspora continue to be supportive of encouraging democratic tendencies in Ethiopia, however they might do so. It might be by supporting investment in the country, creating businesses there, sending remittances back, volunteering maybe after retirement in North America or Europe or wherever they are living. There are all kinds of ways that the diaspora has performed effectively and importantly on behalf of Ethiopia, and it can continue to do so. I've been associated with one organization for many years, the People to People, which has provided medical doctors, medical personnel, and done a great deal, I think, to improve the medical situation in Ethiopia. I think that kind of support is very helpful. But I've even been surprised with the People to People organization to have seen in the last couple of months some diatribes dealing with ethnicity that have deeply troubled me. And I just hope that can be brought to a halt.
Ambassador, I have finished my questions. In case there are points you want to that I didn't cover, I give you the last chance.
No, the only point I would like to make is that I continue to be very optimistic about the future, the long-term future of Ethiopia. I think we're as I say, at a watershed at the moment. I think what Ethiopia decides to do in the next within the next year or so is going to be critical for the long-term future of the country. I'm very hopeful that it will still make the right kinds of decisions. I want to see a unified Ethiopia. I don't want to see one that starts pulling apart. I have a great love for the country and the people of Ethiopia, all the people. I don't care which ethnic group they're from. And I want to return to Ethiopia as I regularly do. It's been a little over a year since my last visit to a country that is unified and working and successful.
Ambassador, I thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon. And I intend to keep in touch with you, and so that we can get your views. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. My thanks to Ambassador David Shinn, a former ambassador to Ethiopia, on a wide-ranging interview. Thank you for watching. This is ESAT from Washington, D.C.